And we see this in the succession of kings in Israel. And not just in the succession, we saw this starting out from the very first. Saul, who may have started off, if we want to say, on a high note, but quickly went downhill. David, although he was probably the greatest king that Israel saw, was not without fault, was not totally blameless, although he sought God in repentance, and although he sought God's favor, he was a man after God's own heart. This is still a warning that Solomon needed to take upon himself, and that Solomon was warning all of the kings that would come after him, but also look at the people, that this is not the way that it should be. In verse 17, he goes on, "Happy are you, O land, when your king is the son of the nobility, and your princes feast at the proper time for strength and not for drunkenness." Throwing caution to the wind is what they were doing, when instead they should be mindful of their position. They should understand the responsibility that they have, and that your king is not just anybody, and that your princes feast for strength and not for drunkenness. Any questions or comments? Yeah, Shane.
Verse 12 says, "Execute justice in the morning, deliver from the hand of the oppressor." So he was actually doing something else, which should have been performing justice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those, where, in what verse was that? Jeremiah what? Jeremiah 21:12. Yeah, there's certain functions, again, that the nobility, the kings, the princes, all of these people in these positions should be performing certain functions at certain times, but instead they're using it for their own self-indulgence instead of actually serving the land and serving the people. Any others? Going into verse 18, we see kind of a similarity between verses 18 and 19. Through sloth, the roof sinks in, and through indolence, the house leaks. Bread is made for laughter, wine gladdens life, and money answers everything. Probably no truer words have been spoken. But you think about through sloth, through indolence, these descriptions of what can happen when people take on these qualities or allow these qualities to rule their lives, to rule their hearts. The roof doesn't just sink in all at once. It takes time. It takes a matter of not caring about the condition or the state of the house. And pretty soon, before you know it, over the period of time, these things have taken place. You think about all of the ways that the Bible talks about making sure that we are good stewards with what we have, and how we need to be taking even our cues from the smallest creatures in nature. Considering the ant, how much they work, how hardworking they are, how they make sure that everything is as it should be. Yet through sloth, the roof sinks in. Through indolence, the house leaks. That you just allow your house to fall into ruin. Again, that's essentially what we see with the kings of Israel and Judah. They did not take care with what they had been given. And if we even want to take a modern example today, we think about we think about the church and how we are to, in a sense, we are stewards with what has been given, understanding, just as the king should, that the kingdom of Israel did not belong to them. They were merely kings and stewards over it. The church does not belong to us. We are part of it, and yet we have been given a great responsibility to take care of what has been passed down. And thank God that we have a guide to be able to take care of and to steward what we have been given in His Word. We would be totally lost if we did not have it. And what the church finds itself in is that the church is totally lost when we take what we have been given and we toss it to the side and we say that, no, we know better. How dare we exhibit such arrogance and ignorance? Which is why the standard that God has given us is so important. Which is why we need to humble ourselves before a holy and righteous God, fall before His throne, and understand that we have been given a tremendous blessing. And we should not let it slip through our fingers, and we should not ignore it as others do. Questions, comments? Verse 20. Even in your thoughts, do not curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich. For a bird of the air will carry your voice, or some winged creature tell the matter. Sometimes we don't understand the power that not just our words hold, we don't understand the power that even our thoughts hold. Something that we think is personal, that's private to myself, can manifest itself in different ways that we couldn't possibly understand. And you think about the instruction that is here: do not curse the king, do not curse the rich. This can take on different layers. We think about the respect that should be shown, and we think about the proper attitude that we should have, understanding that there are some who occupy positions that we do not, that there are certain functions that need to be played, and we might not be suited to play those functions. We should not speak out in various ways that we sometimes do, or speak against those people. And we need to understand that we hold a certain position too. So even in your thoughts, do not curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich. Why? For a bird of the air will carry your voice. Sometimes we think not just things said in private, but things thought in private. It can't possibly leave here. That's not always the case. And you think about something that could come about by speaking against the king or speaking against the rich, finding ourselves in position that we wouldn't find ourselves in had we not said those things, or had they not been manifested in certain ways. The Bible speaks so much on our words. The words that we use and how we use them. The taming, as James would describe it, the taming of the tongue. We have been able, as human beings, to tame every animal just about on the face of the earth. But James said there's one thing that we cannot tame, and that's our tongue. Again, speaking brashly and speaking things that we are ignorant about, speaking things that we don't understand, leads to some very severe consequences, not just for ourselves, but for other people as well. Birds of the air will carry your voice. Some winged creature is going to tell the matter. But Jesus took it a step further, and instead of just talking about our words and watching our words, Jesus took it to the heart of the matter, which is actually the heart, the very center of ourselves. If you want to think about it this way, what makes us us? And Jesus said it's not just committing an act of murder. It's not even harboring hatred in your heart toward your brother. It's not just committing the act of adultery. It's living a life with lust in your heart. Jesus really takes it deeper to the root of it. And it's all about the human heart. And so it's not just about speaking something, but it's about even, do we allow the thoughts to bounce around in our head without bringing them under control? Without bringing them under control of the Spirit of God, of the Word of God, of going to God in prayer and asking Him to remove those things from ourselves. There are so many things. We congratulate ourselves so many times. You know, I only thought it. I didn't say it. Well, congratulations to all of us. But what are we going to do when the thought comes up again and again, and we allow it to take residence within our hearts, and we do not evict it? Any questions, comments? Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. 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 Paul says something similar in Colossians, except he says the reverse of it. Make sure that you are not taken captive by philosophy and empty deceit according to human tradition. So there is a real danger. If we are not taking every thought captive to Christ, then we are going to be taken captive by every philosophy and of an empty deceit. So it is. We sometimes hear, and this brought to mind too. We sometimes hear maybe a division or a distinction between active Christianity and passive Christianity. Passive Christianity being, and what I mean by that is those who just show up, and that's the extent of their Christian lives. But we understand the more that we read Scripture, it is you cannot be a Christian. You cannot be a passive Christian. That's not what Christianity is. Being a Christian is very active. It is active in everything, even down to our thoughts. That we as Christians are to take every thought captive. Go ahead. Yep. Mhm. Right. Yep. Yep. Reminds me of that movie in the early mid-90s, Osmosis Jones. Maybe only a few will remember that movie. Anyway, that's irrelevant. That's just a random thought. Thinking about osmosis, and probably one of the biggest examples of that is staying in a swimming pool too long. You get wrinkled. And it's because it has to do, I'm not a scientist, it has to do with the water content, that it has to go somewhere. That's not the way that we find our Christian faith being lived. We can encourage one another, we can edify one another, and just by being together, we can find enjoyment in that, but it extends so much deeper. Yeah, Dick.
Think about osmosis. You think about today how the world is trying to change our minds
Mm-hmm.
with their thoughts. And then you think of Christianity, broadly speaking, they don't adhere to the doctrine, to the specifics. They
Right.
take it in a broad sense. And so that will delude you if you let it.
Mm-hmm.
It will delude our faith. And it's good to be here 2 or 3 times a week and hear it.
Mm-hmm. It is, and understanding that even in that, that's not the sum of our faith. Any others? Yes, Robert.
There's a practical aspect too of this. This is written 3,100 years ago, or rather 3,100 years ago, and they didn't have. There's no such thing as free speech.
Mm-hmm.
That would be foreign to everybody.
Right.
Now in Israel, it might be a little bit looser because God is freedom he gave people. But so there's a practical aspect about God's people are to bless, not curse anyway. But there's the possibility that it'll get back to you and you'll suffer consequences.
Mm-hmm.
So your speech will make a difference. And I think many of the congregation know Gary Dahl,
Mm-hmm.
and he's been to Cuba.
Yeah.
And the church there maybe does a little bit better than Survive, but that's about all it does. And the reason why is he said they don't get into politics.
Mm-hmm.
That's their job to preach the word. And those denominations who do get into politics, well, they're kicked out.
Right.
So the church is able to stay because it's actually doing the job as the scripture says, and they do not curse the king.
Mm-hmm.
They're just out preaching the word. So there's that practical aspect that makes a difference. It may make a difference, hopefully not, but maybe one of these days it may make a difference to us. We'll have to be careful with our thoughts and our speech.
Yeah. As I've sometimes said, the gospel is offensive enough. Sometimes we take great pains, and I say, unfortunately, great pleasure in speaking ill of other people. We don't have to do that in order to assert or to show our faith to God. The gospel is offensive enough. The gospel is going to offend anyway. But that's what our duty is. We do not preach the gospel offensively. It's going to do that on its own. And yet we've taken great pains and sometimes great pleasure in speaking more than sometimes we should. Any others? Going into verse 11 or chapter 11. Looking at verses 1 through 4, these are sectioned off again in another block of Proverbs, where Solomon writes, "Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a portion to 7 or even to 8, for you know not what disaster may happen on earth. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or to the north, and the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap." So again, thinking about this section of verses, and thinking about it in terms that Solomon has been encouraging his readers to do, of living a life of wisdom, understanding, putting life into perspective, that there are risks in life, We don't know what tomorrow is going to hold. And even James, again, tells us that it's arrogance to think that we do, and all such boasting is evil. Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. What does Solomon mean by this? When I think about it in a literal sense, I think about going to feed the ducks at a pond. Cast bread upon the waters. I don't find it after many days because it's all eaten up. So what does Solomon mean by this? Okay, that's part of it. Absolutely. Anyone else?
Of course, you have to be careful of doing reading and it's not here. So you have to be careful, but perhaps also talking about, go ahead and take a chance. Go ahead and reach out. If you do that in wisdom, you will have a reward. Go ahead, don't be afraid to reach out. Step into that unknown. What you say with faith, because then it will come back.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Tony, you were about to say something?
I think he's saying that you shouldn't hoard your resources. Put them out there, let them have their effect, because sooner or later you're going to benefit from them.
Mm-hmm.
And if you just hoard them, they accomplish nothing.
Yeah, but taking all of those things, that's exactly right. Cast your bread upon the waters. Don't hold on to it. Verse 2 kind of begins to define this too. Give a portion to 7 or even to 8. Share what you have. Share your resources. Why? For you do not know what disaster may happen on earth. Again, there are going to be things that we can't possibly foresee. Now, he does go on to in verse 3 to say, well, there are some things that we can see. There's some things that we can predict. If the clouds are full of rain, will they empty themselves on the earth? If a tree falls to the south or to the north, and the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. Verse 4, he who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. There are certain things that we can predict. There are many things that we cannot. And he says that it's wiser to share what we have, because then it can do much better and more good than it can than if we hold on to it.
I think verse 4 is kind of the key to this section, that if we wait for the perfect moment, it's just not going to come.
Mm-hmm. And using wisdom in these things. It doesn't mean that we just get rid of everything, but it means that we try to do the best that we can in reading the situation, reading the scenario, reading the days, and distributing according to that. And just like you said, Tony, he who observes and will not sow. Well, what? Earlier in chapter 3, Solomon said, well, there's a time for everything. There's a time to sow, there's a time to reap, but we would also say there's a time not to sow, there's a time not to reap. That's what he's saying here. That when we use wisdom in these things, we are going to then know what the best time is. But one of the best things to do is not to hold on to it. It is a very wise thing to get what you have out there so that it can do the most good. Any questions, comments?
Earlier instructions about sowing and reaping, the time to
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean, I think, specific. I think it's
Right.
more like you sow in the spring, you reap in
Mm-hmm.
the fall, but it doesn't name the day.
Right.
And in this passage, it speaks more specifically. And I've been fishing last week,
Mm-hmm.
and the winds come in certain directions. It's a good day for fishing. Well, if you wait until you get to just the perfect wind, you're not going to catch any fish.
Mm-hmm.
Spend time in the shade.
Right. You're going to spend so much time focusing on just one thing instead of looking at the larger picture. Yeah. And yes, ma'am.
This is one of the criteria that money management strategies are.
Mhm.
Don't put all of your eggs in one basket, diversify, and you can't wait for the perfect time to do these kinds of things. But the parable of the good steward that hid his
Mhm.
stuff in the ground and didn't do it is also the other thing. But the gifting must come first. The tithe must come first in this money management strategy. That's just the way God set it up. If we don't put him first, then, the others is for it. But he'll take care of the rest of it, like resting on the Sabbath.
Mhm.
We could get more done in 6 days, and through a cat, and just proving that in Chick-fil-A.
Mhm.
God's ways are his way. He's got something for everything, and there are over 2,500 mentions of money management in the Word. So, this is the key right here, is the Word of God. Put it in application.
And there's an attitude aspect here too, and that is generosity. Um, we see that example at the start of the church, that the church was generous. And you think about that we are, as Paul says in Galatians 6, that we are to do good unto all people, especially those of the household of faith. Not only, but especially. So we see the church looking out for one another and being generous with what they have. We think about Ananias and Sapphira. What was their sin? Their sin was not holding back a portion. Their sin was lying. That was their sin. Peter looked at him and said, if you had been honest, said, this is what we got, but this is what we need for ourselves, that wouldn't have been an issue. And so we see, even in the earliest example of the church, that they were generous, and that's what Solomon is conveying here. Be generous, and you will see some sort of return in that. Any others before we move on? Look at verse 5. And these are still kind of proverbs in a sense, something that we need to keep in mind, and even ways that we need to look at life. As you do not know the way the spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. Again, no truer words have been spoken. And here, Solomon uses what is a very controversial topic today, using life coming into the womb of a woman with child. We don't know all the ins and outs of that, but wow, human development, science, embryology has come a long, long, long way to where it is no longer scientifically disputed when life begins. But you look at that and you study it, and all you need is a very small amount of learning and education in that, to where you understand that the development of human life, the development of any life, but especially human life, is magnificent. It is something that we understand a whole lot better today, but it is something that should continue to humble us, because we do not understand, nor will we understand, everything about it. And just as we do not know all of the intricacies, all of the ins and outs of the beginning human life, so we do not know the work of God who makes everything. There's things about the work of God and the works that He does. When we think that we have God figured out, we don't. Again, that is something that should humble us. That God's works are so magnificent that we cannot possibly begin to chisel and figure it all out. That our chiseling is going to be as if we were taking a thumbtack to a boulder. We're never going to be able to figure out everything, and that's the point. That is how great and magnificent God is. That's how glorious He is. And then you begin to think, okay, so our efforts to try and figure that out, what are they compared to Him? And we realize that compared to God, we are nothing. Our efforts are nothing. And yet you then begin to think about the love that God has for us. What is man that you are mindful of him? And do we ever sit and just think about those verses? And the Son of Man, that you care for him. So thinking about who we are compared to who God is, our figuring out what life is all about and the progress that human ingenuity, and we could say, though, that that's the gifting of God to mankind, but that human ingenuity, the progress that we have made, and how we have barely even with that scratched the surface. That, in a nutshell, is humility. Any final comments or questions before we close out?
30 years ago, a sister defended her husband, who was a businessman and seldom attended worship, even though the family professed to be active Christians. He was always working, and her explanation for that is he wants to work hard and make a lot of money so he can do big things with the Lord in the future. Well, I think the devil got him, because those big things
Never happened. The best laid plans of mice and men. That is one of my that's one of my favorite thoughts and favorite sayings. Yeah, what does Jesus say we need to be doing to do the works of God? Believe in the Son.
waited to serve too long.
Yeah,
And as Solomon said, we talked about last week, time and chance
happen.
everywhere. We don't know what the future is going to bring. And holding up and saving, we all have some concerns for
Mhm.
the future, but maybe our concerns are too great.
Yep,
Maybe we need to use our resources now.
absolutely. Any others? Thank you so much for being here this morning. We will pick back up with chapter 11, moving into chapter 12 and toward the end of the book. I appreciate your time, your comments, and your questions, so thank you.